Are you afraid?
I don't think so. Are you?
I am. Very.
What's up, everybody? Welcome once again. Our Twilight Zone review marathon continues with another spacebound episode. People are alike all over. Up front, I'll admit, I'm a fan of most Twilight Zones that sent explorers off into the cosmos. Parallel, Death Ship, and Elegy come to mind. The Twilight Zone series was ideal for tales about astronauts blasting off into unknown regions. After all, the 1960s was the era of space exploration. But when it comes to meeting people from another planet, the question is, does this episode lean on the hopeful side, or does it go in a darker route? People Are Alike All Over was episode 25 from season 1. It was directed by Mitchell Lesson and written by Rod Serling. However, the teleplay was based on a 1952 short story, Brothers Beyond the Void, by Paul W. Fairman. As always, spoilers are ahead.
You're looking at a species of flimsy little two-legged animal with extremely small heads, whose name is man. They're taking a highway into space. Man unshackling himself and sending his tiny groping fingers up into the unknown. Their destination is Mars. And in just a moment, we'll land there with them.
This was a fast-paced episode. In terms of story, things moved along quite quickly. On the night before their mission to Mars, we're introduced to two astronauts. Conrad, the scientist, as played by Roddy Mcdowell, and Markison, as played by Paul Comey. The differences between the two men are very clear. Markison is fairly optimistic and has a positive philosophy that people are alike everywhere. Conrad, however, is the opposite. He's a lot more cynical and fearful of the unknown.
I'm frightened of what we'll find up there.
Well, that's the one thing you shouldn't be frightened of. Well, the unknown, sure. The loneliness, the silence, that should scare anybody. But I've got a philosophy about people. I mean all people, Sam. They're the same all over.
The contrasting outlooks of the two men sets up an interesting dynamic. And as we'll see, the outlooks of both men will eventually become a central theme. Unfortunately for Markison, when their ship crash lands on Mars, he's seriously injured. Soon it becomes obvious that Markison will not be alive much longer. Upon hearing knocking on the ship, both men realize there are aliens just outside. Markison pleads with Conrad to open the door. This was one of the more memorable scenes, as the tension was quite high, and you're put on the spot of either siding with Conrad, who's fearful, or Markison, the optimist, who wants to achieve a semblance of accomplishment in the mission before he passes away.
I want you to open the door now. You can lock it behind me. Just help me up. That's all I ask. Please, help me up.
Conrad's fears take over, and he refuses to open the door. Essentially, he denies the dying wish of his friend, a low point for the character. Ultimately, the choice of meeting the Martians is made for Conrad, as they open the door themselves. However, to Conrad's surprise, he finds that the Martians are humanoid. They're pretty much what Markison said they would be. We soon learn that the Martians have mind-reading abilities, which allows them to communicate, and thankfully they seem quite friendly, and even offer to bury Markison. One Martian that stands out is Tina, who reassures Conrad everything's alright. It's pretty obvious Conrad is, let's say, distracted by Tina. The next day, the friendly group of Martians lead their new Earthling pal to a beautiful dwelling, a replica of an Earth home, which they've literally created overnight just for him. Alien tech is no joke. So up until this point, the aliens don't seem hostile, they haven't hurt Conrad, and they've even constructed a home just for him. But as the old expression goes, this all seems too good to be true.
I was so frightened, so miserably frightened.
Don't be frightened, Mr. Conrad. No one will hurt you. No one will hurt you. You must believe that.
The episode drops some hints that the Martians may not be as benevolent as they seem. The only problem is our lead Conrad can't read a room. For example, Tina almost always looks somber while everyone else has phony smiles. But then to top it off, there's this Martian handshake.
You're suspect.
Anyway, Conrad relaxes for a bit, but soon enough he discovers his new dwelling is actually windowless, and the doors are sealed. Basically, he's in a well-furnished cage. Now on my first watch, this scene gave me a sinking feeling. Being locked away is a horrifying thought anyone can relate to. Sure enough, the walls slide open, and Conrad realizes he's become the latest exhibit in the Martian Zoo. A terrifying and dark ending. The conclusion was amplified by the fact that Conrad was hesitant to go on the mission from the very beginning.
Markison! Markison, you are right!
People are alike. People are alike everywhere.
So this was another solid Twilight Zone episode. There's a good amount to discuss here, so let's dive right in. In the beginning of the show, we got some great foreshadowing with the two astronauts behind a fence, much like caged animals. I think what's most important about the opening moments were the two different outlooks that were offered up. Conrad was a pessimist and a defeatist. He feared the unknown. Marcuson, however, was much more of an optimist. When he stated people are alike everywhere, the implication was clearly meant to be reassuring. So Marcuson was right, people are alike all over, but in this instance, his optimistic slant didn't account for the fact that while humans have the capacity to be kind and caring, we're just as capable of being evil. In fact, history has shown we tend to go that route. Although it was bleak, the twist ending in this episode was quite memorable. The thought of Conrad spending the rest of his life in a cage is depressing. The idea that he was in a zoo left an impression on me. That said, I don't think the message here was down with zoos or anything like that. Conrad wasn't a zookeeper on Earth who got his comeuppance. These men were astronauts. They were explorers. Instead, I think it's another Twilight Zone that's taken a shot at the darker aspects of humanity. Caging a human in a zoo is essentially reflecting our own capacity for exploitation and cruelty toward others, justified by a false sense of superiority. Conrad becoming a caged spectacle illustrates this point pretty dramatically, and it's a fitting, creepy Twilight Zone twist, that's for sure. I also wanted to toss out another possibility as to the reasoning behind Conrad ending up in a zoo. Now, in the short story, Brothers Beyond the Void, which is the episode this was based on, there were quite a few differences. First and foremost, only Marcuson, the optimist, went on a journey and ended up getting caged. However, the aliens were not as similar as they appeared on the show. Instead, they're described as having sea green eyes and being considerably shorter, and they spoke in a pleasant bird-like language. Imagine that. With that in mind, if the humans looked and spoke differently than the Martians, it makes sense for them to maybe throw them in a zoo. So it's possible the zoo concept was a remnant of the short story that happened to fit in with Rod Serling's expanded adaptation. In my view, Rod Serling's changes improved greatly upon the original short story. The betrayal from the seemingly benevolent humans came off as a lot more shocking than it would have if the Martians had been made smaller and more alien-like. The acting in this episode was very strong, with good performances all around. Susan Oliver as Tenia didn't have very many lines, but her character served as a glimmer of hope. In hindsight, it's clear she knew what was coming, and probably felt guilty about it. I'd like to think if this story were to continue, maybe Tenia would free Conrad, and they'd run off together, fleeing the planet, living happily ever after. Although Paul Comey didn't get as much screen time, he was convincing as an idealistic explorer. However, it was Roddy Mcdowell who really stole the show here. He was great. Throughout the whole episode, it was hard not to root for the guy. Sure, he was jittery and nervous and far too fearful, but it's hard to be critical of him for that, considering how things turned out. Most people are probably familiar with Roddy Mcdowell from the Planet of the Apes movies and TV series. He was a great actor, and I think it's pretty obvious he had a sense of humor.
One of Hollywood's nicest gentlemen and one of Hollywood's most familiar faces, Roddy Mcdowell. Hello, Roddy.
Hello, Carol.
But I think most of us horror fans will be familiar with Roddy Mcdowell from the 1985 classic, Fright Night. There's no way I was going to review an episode starring Roddy Mcdowell and not mention Fright Night. Anyway, if there's any lesson to take from People Are Alike all over, I think it's that when it comes to people, you always have to take the bad with the good. But be very mindful of the bad, as this story demonstrates. If people are alike all over, that also applies to them being flat out awful. I give this episode 4 out of 5 Martian handshakes. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hit subscribe if you enjoyed this. Be well.